The radio crackled with static, then silence. Command hadn't heard from Viper 2-1 in 47 minutes. The operations center at Bagram Airfield hummed with the familiar tension of missions gone dark, but this silence carried weight. Major Danvers stood at the tactical display, his jaw working a piece of gum into pulp, watching the blank sector where an entire forward operating base should have been reporting contact. 12 Marines, 1 platoon. And now, nothing but the hiss of dead air across frequencies that should have been screaming with gunfire reports and casualty updates. The Hindu Kush mountains sprawled across the satellite feed like the broken teeth of some ancient god, each ridge and valley a potential grave. Somewhere in that maze of rock and snow, Outpost Keating was either fighting for survival or already overrun. The nearest Apache strike team was 23 minutes out. The nearest conventional air support, nearly double that. Someone muttered about drone feeds. Someone else mentioned QRF response times. But Danvers kept staring at a single identifier on the board, Hog 13, an A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Reaper, piloted by Captain Indira Indy Kaur. She was 17 minutes out, carrying a full combat load, already diverted from a routine patrol over Helmand Province. The name drew snickers from the two Air Force liaisons near the coffee station. Everyone knew the stories. Kaur had washed out of F-16 training 3 years prior. Her dream of flying fast and high traded for the slow, ugly grind of close air support in the Warthog. The jokes practically wrote themselves. She was stubborn, they said. Couldn't let it go. Took the A-10 assignment like some kind of punishment detail and treated every sortie like she had something to prove. Danvers had seen her personnel file. Daughter of a commercial pilot from Fresno, first-generation American, top marks in tactics, but that one evaluation report that tanked her fighter qualification. Lacks the aggressive instinct required for air superiority operations. So they gave her the Warthog, the plane nobody wanted to fly, slow, ungainly, built around a gun so powerful it could shred tanks and rattle the fillings out of your teeth. But 17 minutes, Danvers checked his watch. 16 now. The satellite feed flickered. Thermal signatures bloomed across the outpost perimeter. Dozens of them, moving fast. The Marines at Keating weren't dark because they'd fallen. They were dark because they were fighting so hard they couldn't spare a breath for radio checks. And somewhere above the clouds, pushing her twin turbofans past recommended cruise speed, Indy Kaur was screaming toward a battle that would define everything she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. The mountains didn't care about urgency. They simply existed, vast and indifferent, their peaks scraping 11,000 feet while Kaur kept her Warthog low, hugging the valleys where radar couldn't kiss her and shoulder-fired missiles had to guess. The A-10 shuddered through turbulence, its titanium bathtub cockpit absorbing the punishment while her hands stayed smooth on the stick. She'd stopped listening to the tactical frequency 5 minutes ago. Too much noise. Too many voices calling for support that wasn't coming fast enough. Instead, she monitored the emergency guard channel, waiting for the one transmission that mattered. It came at 0943 local. Any station, this is Viper 2-1 actual, troops in contact, danger close, Firebase Keating is being overrun. I say again, we are being overrun. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Marco Reyes, 24 years old, West Point graduate. This was his first deployment. Kaur could hear the controlled panic underneath his training, the way his words clipped short, rationing breath between sentences. She keyed her mic. Viper 2-1, Hog 13, I'm 12 minutes out, give me a sitrep. The relief in Reyes' voice was almost painful. Hog 13, we've got approximately 75 enemy fighters on the northern and eastern perimeter. They're inside the wire. Mortars on the high ground. 2 KIA, 5 wounded. We're about to lose the aid station. Kaur pulled up her targeting pod feed, cycling through the weapons loadout displayed on her right multifunction display. 1,100 rounds of 30mm ammunition in the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon, 6 AGM-65 Mavericks, 2 rocket pods with 7 Hydras each, enough ordnance to turn a grid square into a parking lot, but only if she could put steel exactly where it needed to go without turning those Marines into pink mist. Copy your traffic, Viper. I need you to mark your perimeter with smoke, Whatever color you've got. We're out of smoke, Reyes said. Used it all in the first 15 minutes. Of course they had. Core checked her altitude, 800 feet above ground level and climbing as the valley opened toward the outpost. The weather was degrading, cloud cover dropping like a curtain at 9,000 feet. She could see the dark smudge of smoke rising from Keating's position, 3 kilometers ahead. Black smoke. Burning fuel or rubber. Nothing good. Viper 2-1, I'm visual on your smoke. Talk me onto the target. What's your most immediate threat? Static. Then, everything. They're hitting us from every direction. Machine gun nests on the ridgeline to the north. Mortar teams somewhere in the tree line east. And they've got RPGs walking toward the command post. Core's jaw tightened. Standard tactics for a coordinated assault. Pin the defenders, suppress their movement, then push fighters through the breach. Whoever was running this attack knew what they were doing. She pushed the throttles forward, felt the Warthog's twin General Electric turbofans respond with their characteristic whine. The A-10 wasn't graceful. It didn't slice through the air like the fighters she'd wanted to fly. It muscled through, blunt and relentless, exactly like the close air support mission it was born to execute. The tactical display painted the terrain in stark relief. Outpost Keating sat in a bowl, surrounded by high ground on 3 sides. A nightmare defensive position. Some desk jockey at brigade had probably looked at a map and thought it controlled a key infiltration route. But maps didn't account for the way bullets rolled downhill or how easy it was to rain mortars into a fixed position when you owned every ridge within 2 kilometers. Viper 2-1, Hog 1-3 is 30 seconds out. I need you to get your heads down. Tell me when you're set. Reyes' response came through labored breathing. Copy. All stations, air support inbound. Get to cover now. Core dropped to 500 feet, skimming the valley floor where the terrain masked her approach. Her eyes tracked the ridgeline, searching for muzzle flashes. There. 3 positions. She could see the wink of machine gun fire sparking against the rocks. The enemy had set up in a horseshoe pattern, interlocking fields of fire designed to shred anyone who moved in the outpost below. Her left hand moved to the master arm switch. Her right thumb hovered over the weapon release. The targeting reticle drifted across the ridgeline, bouncing with every pocket of rough air. She didn't rush. Rushing got people killed. The first rule of close air support was simple: be sure. The A-10 roared over the outpost at 300 knots, low enough that she could see individual fighting positions. Marines hunched behind HESCO barriers while tracers stitched the ground around them. She pulled into a climbing left turn, bleeding airspeed, rolling the aircraft until the ridgeline filled her canopy. The targeting pod locked. The first machine gun nest resolved into clarity. 3 fighters, a PKM machine gun on a tripod, sandbags stacked in a crude crescent. They hadn't seen her yet. They were too focused on the Americans below, too certain of their high ground advantage. Core's finger tightened on the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon spoke with a sound like the universe tearing itself apart. 65 rounds per second. Each projectile a mix of high explosive and depleted uranium, designed to punch through tank armor. Against human targets and sandbags, the effect was biblical. The ridgeline erupted. Dust and rock and pieces of things that used to be whole geysered into the air. The cannon's recoil shuddered through the airframe, slowing the Warthog mid-flight like some giant hand pressing against its nose. 3 seconds. That's all she gave it. 3 seconds of concentrated violence that erased the machine gun nest and 10 meters of terrain around it. The A-10 shook off the cannon's recoil and Core halted into another turn, her G-suit inflating around her legs and torso, squeezing blood back toward her brain. Below, the Marines at Keating were already moving, using the momentary suppression to reposition and return fire. She could see muzzle flashes from their M4s now, disciplined 3-round bursts instead of the panic spray that marked a unit on the edge of breaking. Good effect, Reyes called over the radio. His voice carried a thread of hope now. We've got 2 more nests on the eastern ridge. Grid November Delta 736421. Core punched the coordinates into her targeting system while simultaneously scanning for the telltale signature of a missile launch. The A-10 was tough, stupidly tough, designed to absorb ground fire and keep flying. But even the Warthog couldn't shrug off a Stinger or an SA-7 if it connected just right. She found the second nest. Different setup this time. The fighters had learned from watching their comrades vanish in a cloud of 30mm fury. They'd spread out, using natural defilade in the rocks to mask their position. Smart. Adaptive. She'd have to come in from a different angle, work the terrain to her advantage. The Warthog dropped toward the deck again, Core pushing the nose down until the airspeed indicator climbed past 320 knots. Too fast for optimal gun employment, but speed was life when the enemy had time to track you. She jinked left, then right, throwing off any aim solutions. The targeting pod slewed across the ridgeline. There, movement in the rocks. She caught the distinctive shape of an RPG tube swinging toward the outpost. They were setting up for another volley, trying to knock out the command post while the Americans were still reeling. Not today. Core rolled inverted, pulled the nose down toward the horizon, and let the world flip upside down for 3 heartbeats. The blood rushed to her head. The horizon spun. Then she rolled wings level and squeezed the trigger again. The GAU-8 roared its song. This time she walked the fire across the rocks, adjusting her aim point mid-burst, letting the cannon's recoil slow the Warthog while she stitched a line of destruction across the eastern ridge. High-explosive rounds detonated against stone. Shrapnel sang through the air. The RPG team disappeared in a cloud of pulverized rock and gray smoke. "Splash," she called, banking hard to avoid overflying the kill zone. 2 nests down. "What else you got for me, Viper?" Static crackled. Then Ray's came back, his voice tight. "Mortars. We can't get a fix on them. They're somewhere in the tree line, grid November Delta 735412, but it's thick canopy. Every time we think we've got them spotted, they displace." The tree line was a problem. Dense evergreens clustered along the valley floor, their canopy thick enough to hide entire squads. Mortars were simple weapons: a tube, a base plate, and someone who could do math. Drop a round down the tube, adjust for wind and elevation, repeat until your target stopped moving. Mobile. Deadly. Nearly impossible to spot from the air unless they were actively firing. Core climbed to 7,000 feet, giving herself the altitude to work with while she studied the terrain. The A-10 sensors weren't built for hunting hidden mortars through triple canopy forest. This was a job for a Reaper drone with synthetic aperture radar, or a Kiowa Scout helicopter that could hover and peek. But the nearest drone was retasking from another sector, and the helicopters weren't cleared to fly in these winds. She was it. Alone. In a plane designed to kill tanks, trying to find a mortar team hiding in the woods like they'd done 1,000 times before. "Viper 2-1, I need you to watch for their next shot. When they fire, I need an azimuth, fast. Copy, stand by." The radio went quiet. Core circled, her eyes scanning the tree line, looking for anything: smoke, muzzle flash, movement, displaced birds. The A-10 droned through the thin air at altitude, its turbofan spinning with mechanical patience. She checked her fuel state. 42 minutes until bingo. 42 minutes until she'd have no choice but to break station and head for the tanker track, leaving the Marines below to fend for themselves until the next aircraft arrived. If the next aircraft arrived, the clouds were lowering, weather rolling in from the north like it had a personal grudge. In 30 minutes, this valley could be socked in, visibility 0, every aircraft grounded. The mortar's distinctive thump echoed across the valley, audible even over the engine noise. Core's head snapped left. There. A puff of smoke, small and gray, rising from the tree line. "Hog 1-3, I've got smoke. Bearing 045 from our position, maybe 800 meters. Ray's voice cut through the static like a knife. Core rolled the Warthog onto its wing, pulling the nose toward the azimuth. Her eyes tracked the smoke trail, following it down into the trees. The mortar team would displace now, move 50 meters and set up again. Standard counter-battery procedure. But they had to move through the forest, and that meant breaking concealment, even if only for seconds. She armed a Maverick missile, let the seeker head slave to the targeting pod. The infrared sensor painted the world in shades of white and gray. Hot signatures glowed, cool ones faded. And there, moving through the trees like ghosts, 3 thermal images, human-shaped, carrying something between them. The mortar tube. She locked the missile and fired. The AGM-65 dropped from the rail, its rocket motor igniting a half-second later. White smoke trailed behind as it streaked toward the tree line, guiding on the heat signatures with single-minded purpose. The Maverick punched through the canopy and detonated with a flat crack that echoed off the valley walls. Trees shredded, earth fountained. The thermal images vanished in a bloom of white-hot fire that overloaded the targeting pod's sensor. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing but a crater and burning timber. "Splash," Core called. "Mortar team is down." Ray's response was almost lost in the background noise of small arms fire. "Good hit, Hog, but we've got a new problem. They're massing for a push on the south wall. Maybe 25 fighters. If they break through there, we lose the whole perimeter." Core checked her ordnance. 5 Mavericks remaining, 13 rockets, and 900 rounds of 30mm. Enough to make a difference, but only if she used it right. She pulled the Warthog into a descending turn, dropping back down to where the air was thick and the turbulence rattled her teeth. The south wall of Outpost Keating was a patchwork of HESCO barriers and concertina wire, reinforced with sandbags that had seen better days. She could see the Marines there, maybe 8 of them, firing from behind cover while rounds snapped overhead. And beyond the wire, emerging from the scattered compounds and rocky outcroppings, came the assault force. They moved with discipline, bounding from cover to cover, suppressing the American positions with PKM machine gun fire while their flankers worked around the edges. These weren't untrained insurgents taking potshots. These were fighters who'd done this before, who understood fire and movement, who knew that the only way to survive American air power was to get so close that the aircraft couldn't shoot without hitting friendly forces. Danger close. The phrase haunted every close air support pilot. The moment when your ordnance and your allies occupied the same piece of ground. When the math got complicated and the margin for error shrank to nothing, Core's hands tightened on the stick. She'd been here before, different valley, different outpost, same impossible geometry. She keyed the mic. "Viper 2-1, I can hit them with rockets, but it's going to be close. How close can you get your people to cover?" "We're already in cover," Ray's shot back. "We don't have anywhere else to go. They're 50 meters from the wire." 50 meters, that was nothing. That was spitting distance. That was inside the fragmentation radius of a high-explosive rocket. She pulled up her weapons display, selected the rocket pods, set them for ripple fire. 7 rockets per pod, 14 total, each one carrying a 10-pound warhead that would detonate on impact and send shrapnel screaming in every direction. "I need you to trust me," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was the only truth that mattered in this moment. Ray's didn't hesitate. "We trust you. Send it." The A-10 Dove. Core pushed the stick forward until the nose pointed at the ground and the altimeter unwound like a slot machine paying out. 4,000 feet, 3,000, 2,500. The enemy fighters filled her windscreen, small figures growing larger with every heartbeat. She could see their weapons now, their body armor, the way they moved with confidence, certain that they were too close for the Americans to call in air support without killing their own people. They were wrong. Core's finger hovered over the weapon release. The targeting reticle drifted across the assault force, leading them by a fraction, accounting for the rocket's ballistic arc and the Warthog's airspeed. Everything narrowed to this moment, this calculation, this choice. She pickled the rockets. 14 trails of white smoke erupted from the pods, screaming toward the ground at supersonic speed. The Warthog bucked as 2,000 pounds of ordnance left the rails. Core pulled back on the stick, hauling the aircraft into a climbing turn that grayed her vision at the edges. The rockets impacted in a rolling thunder that walked across the assault force like the footsteps of something ancient and angry. Earth and rock and pieces of humanity scattered. The shockwave rippled across the valley. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition cooked off, tracers spiraling into the sky like demonic fireworks. The radio erupted, voices overlapping. Someone shouting about effects on target, someone else calling for a corpsman, and underneath it all, Ray's voice, steady and clear. "Hog 1-3, you just saved our lives." Core didn't respond immediately. She was too busy scanning for secondary threats, her training screaming at her not to celebrate until she knew the battlefield was clear. But the assault force wasn't coming back. The survivors were breaking contact, dragging wounded and dead back into the compounds, melting into the landscape like they'd never been there. The Marines at Keating were still firing, pouring rounds into the retreat, making sure the enemy knew this ground belonged to them. She checked her fuel. 28 minutes to bingo. The Apache strike team was 5 minutes out now, their gunships loaded for bear and hungry for targets. The immediate crisis was over, but Core didn't turn for home. Not yet. She stayed on station, circling the outpost, watching the perimeter, making sure no one else tried their luck. Because that's what the A-10 did. It stayed. It endured. It protected the people on the ground who couldn't protect themselves. And for the first time in 3 years, Core felt something that had been missing since that evaluation report ended her fighter dreams. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The radio crackled. Hog 1-3, Viper 2-1. Permission to speak freely. Go ahead, Viper. Ray's voice carried a weight now, something deeper than relief. I don't know what they told you when they put you in that aircraft, but from where I'm standing, you're the best goddamn pilot in the Air Force. Words hung in the air like smoke. Core felt something tighten in her chest, a sensation she couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or vindication, or just the simple recognition that what she'd been doing for 3 years, what she'd been told was a consolation prize, actually mattered. She keyed the mic. Just doing my job, Viper. You keep your heads down. The Apache are 2 minutes out. Copy that, and Hog, if you're ever at Bagram, first rounds on me. Core smiled despite herself. I'll hold you to that. The Apache gunships arrived like avenging angels, their rotors chopping the air into submission. Core gave them a quick brief on remaining threats, passed along the coordinates for the destroyed mortar position and machine gun nests, then turned her Warthog north toward the tanker track. The refueling took 15 minutes. The boom operator, a tech sergeant named Willis, came over the radio with the usual banter. Hog 1-3, you sound like you've been busy. Just another day in paradise, Core replied, watching the fuel gauge climb. Heard some chatter on guard frequency, something about troops in contact at Keating. They're still standing, that's what matters. Willis went quiet for a moment. Then, well, whoever pulled their ass out of the fire deserves a medal. That place is a death trap. Core didn't respond. She focused on holding position beneath the tanker, her aircraft steady in the turbulence, taking on the fuel she'd need to make it back to Bagram. When she disconnected and turned south, the weather had closed in completely. The Hindu Kush disappeared beneath a blanket of gray clouds. Somewhere down there, Lieutenant Reyes and his Marines were cleaning weapons, counting ammunition, treating wounded, and trying to process the fact that they'd survived. They'd tell the story later. Over beers at the Chow Hall or in letters home or during the mandatory after-action review. They'd talk about the A-10 that came out of nowhere, the pilot who put ordnance danger close without hesitation, the cannon runs that sounded like God clearing his throat. But they wouldn't know her name. Not yet. In the military's vast bureaucracy of call signs and unit designators, she was just Hog 1-3. Another pilot, another sortie. Another day of turning jet fuel into violence on behalf of people she'd never meet. Core descended through the clouds, punching through at 5,000 feet to find Bagram sprawled across the valley floor like a small city. She called the tower, got her landing clearance, brought the Warthog down on centerline with the gentle kiss of main wheels that marked a pilot who'd done this 1,000 times before. After shutdown, she sat in the cockpit for a long moment. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. The post-flight adrenaline dump hadn't hit yet. It would later, when she was alone in her quarters, and her body remembered that she'd just spent 2 hours in a flying titanium bathtub while people shot at her. The debrief lasted 90 minutes. Core walked the intelligence officers through every target, every weapon expended, every tactical decision. They took notes. They asked questions. They thanked her for her service in the bland, bureaucratic way that meant the paperwork would be filed and the mission would be recorded and life would move on. She walked out into the afternoon sun feeling hollowed out. Not tired exactly, just empty. Like she'd poured everything she had into those 2 hours over Outpost Keating and now had to figure out how to refill the tank. Her phone buzzed. A text from her aircraft crew chief, Staff Sergeant Kowalski. Heard you put on a show. A-10's got some damage but nothing I can't fix. Come by when you can. Corps headed to the flight line. The Warthog sat on the ramp, its gray paint scorched and pitted from ground fire she hadn't even noticed during the engagement. Kowalski was underneath the left wing, inspecting a cluster of bullet holes near the fuselage. 7.62, he said without looking up. Probably PKM fire. Went through the redundant hydraulic lines but missed the primaries. Lucky. Cor ran her hand along the wing. The titanium skin was cool beneath her palm, each dimple and scar a testament to the aircraft's toughness. How long to patch her up? 2 days, maybe 3. Gotta replace some hydraulic lines, do a full systems check, make sure nothing else got tagged. You did a number on the cannon barrel, too. Gonna need to inspect that for wear. Cor nodded. The GAU-8 was a beast, capable of incredible violence, but that violence came at a cost. Every round fired wore down the barrel. Every trigger pull brought the cannon closer to its service life limit. It was a machine built for war, and war consumed everything it touched. She flew good today, Cor said. It was inadequate. The words didn't capture what the A-10 had done, how it had absorbed punishment and kept fighting, how it had delivered violence with surgical precision while shrugging off everything the enemy threw at it. But Kowalski understood. He stood up, wiping grease from his hands, and looked at the aircraft with the kind of affection mechanics reserved for machines that brought their pilots home alive. She always does, he said, and so do you. That night, Cor sat in her quarters and tried to write an email to her father. He'd retired from United Airlines 3 years ago, traded the cockpit for a house in the foothills and a garden he tended with the same precision he'd once used to fly 737s across the Pacific. She wanted to tell him about the mission, about the Marines, about the feeling of putting steel on target and knowing, absolutely knowing, that it mattered, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stared at the blank screen and thought about the path that had brought her here. The fighter pipeline had been everything. Every training sortie, every evaluation, every sim ride had been aimed at one goal: pin on the wings and fly the fastest, most lethal aircraft in the inventory. She'd wanted the F-16, wanted to feel the afterburner kick and push the edge of the envelope where the air was thin and the horizon curved, wanted to be the kind of pilot they made movies about. Instead, she got 3 words on an evaluation: lacks aggressive instinct. Her instructor had been apologetic. It's not about skill, he'd said. You've got the hands, you've got the knowledge, but air-to-air is about killing the other guy before he kills you. It's about commitment to the intercept. And you hesitate just for a second, but a second is all it takes, she'd argued. Of course she had. She'd pulled up her scores, her sim performance, her spotless record. But the Air Force didn't care about arguments. It cared about whether you could do the mission. And if the evaluators said you couldn't, then you couldn't. They'd offered her the A-10 as an alternative: close air support, strike missions. The kind of flying where the enemy was on the ground and your job was to show up when the grunts needed you most. She'd almost turned it down, almost walked away from the whole thing. But her father had said something that stuck with her. Every aircraft has a mission. The question isn't whether the mission is glamorous. The question is whether you're the right person to do it. So she'd taken the assignment. She'd learned to love the Warthog's slow, deliberate approach. She'd mastered the art of putting 30mm rounds within meters of friendly forces. She'd become the kind of pilot who could spend hours circling a battlefield, waiting for the moment when everything depended on her ability to deliver violence with precision. And today, that's exactly what she'd done. She closed the laptop without writing anything. Some things didn't fit into emails, some things you just carried. The next morning, she was scheduled for a routine patrol over Helmand Province. Nothing special, just another sortie, just another day of flying the Warthog through the thin mountain air, scanning for threats, being ready. But when she walked into the operations center for her brief, something was different. The other pilots looked at her differently, not with mockery, not with pity. With something that looked a lot like respect. Major Danvers caught her eye from across the room. He nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than words. She nodded back. Then she grabbed her helmet and walked toward the flight line, where Kowalski and his crew were already prepping her aircraft. The A-10 sat waiting, ugly and beautiful and absolutely perfect for the job it was built to do. By afternoon, the story had spread. Not officially. The military had procedures for that, after-action reports and commendations and formal channels that moved with glacial patience. But the Marines had their own network. Word traveled through the enlisted ranks, passed along by radio men and logistics specialists who heard the recordings of the engagement. They talked about the A-10 pilot who'd come screaming out of the clouds when Outpost Keating was minutes from being overrun. About the cannon run so close that the brass casings rained down on the perimeter like hail. About the rocket strike that vaporized an assault force 50 meters from the wire. They didn't know her name yet, just the call sign, Hog 13, but they knew what she'd done. And in the strange arithmetic of combat where survival was currency and debt was measured in lives, they knew they owed her. Lieutenant Reyes sent the official report up his chain of command. His company commander forwarded it to battalion. Battalion sent it to regiment. Regiment kicked it over to the Air Force liaison who filed it with the appropriate squadron. And somewhere in that bureaucratic journey the story acquired details. Pilot name, Captain Indira Kaur. Call sign, Reaper. 3 years flying the A-10 in theater. 47 combat sorties prior to this one. 0 incidents. 0 complaints. Just a quiet, competent pilot who showed up, did the job, and went home. The kind of aviator who didn't chase glory but somehow ended up neck-deep in it anyway. By the end of the week, her squadron commander called her into his office. Colonel Briggs was a former F-15 pilot, one of those officers whose presence commanded attention without effort. He'd flown in Desert Storm, racked up a respectable combat record, and spent the last decade climbing the ladder toward general officer stars. He gestured for Kaur to sit. She did, keeping her back straight, her hands folded, her face neutral. "I read the after-action report from Outpost Keating," Briggs said. "Sounds like you had an interesting morning." "Yes, sir. Just doing what the mission required." Briggs leaned back in his chair, studying her. "The Marines seem to think you walked on water. Lieutenant Reyes used the phrase, single-handedly saved 12 lives. That's not language we see in official reports very often." Kaur didn't respond. She wasn't sure what he wanted her to say. Briggs pulled a file from his desk. She recognized it immediately, her training record, the one with the evaluation that had ended her fighter career. "I've been thinking about this," Briggs said, tapping the file. "About what makes a good pilot. When I was your age, I thought it was all about stick-and-rudder skills, about who could pull the most GS or land on centerline in a crosswind. But after a couple decades, you realize it's something else. It's about whether you can deliver when it matters." He closed the file. "You delivered, Captain, and I want to make sure that gets recognized." Recognition came in forms both official and otherwise. The Air Force put her in for a Distinguished Flying Cross, the medal reserved for heroism in aerial combat. The paperwork would take months, grinding through channels, accumulating endorsements and reviews. But the unofficial recognition came faster. Other pilots started asking her advice. How to set up attack runs in mountain terrain. How to manage fuel and ordnance when the mission went longer than planned. How to stay calm when the radio was screaming and the ground was exploding and you had to make decisions that would save lives or end them. She answered their questions with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. No bravado, no war stories, just the technical details that might keep them alive. And slowly, something shifted. The jokes about the warthog dried up. The snickers about her call sign faded. In their place came something Kaur had stopped expecting 3 years ago. She became someone people looked up to, not for her aircraft, not for her speed or altitude or any of the metrics that define fighter pilots, but for her competence, her steadiness, her absolute reliability when the situation turned desperate. 2 weeks after Outpost Keating, she flew another mission. This time to support a convoy that had hit an IED and was taking fire from multiple positions. She put Mavericks through 2 buildings sheltering machine gun teams, then stayed on station while the medevac helicopters extracted casualties. The convoy commander, an Army captain named Diaz, sent a bottle of whiskey to her squadron with a note. To the guardian angel with the ugly airplane. Kor never drank it. She gave it to her crew chief, to Kowalski and his team, because they were the ones who kept the Warthog flying. They were the ones who patched bullet holes and replaced hydraulic lines and inspected every rivet to make sure the aircraft would bring her home. The medal ceremony happened on a Thursday in December. The whole squadron turned out, along with a delegation of Marines from Outpost Keating. Lieutenant Reyes was there, standing at attention in his dress uniform, looking uncomfortable in anything that wasn't body armor and a plate carrier. Colonel Briggs read the citation. The words were formal, bureaucratic, stripped of the fear and chaos that had defined that morning in the Hindu Kush. But between the lines, anyone who'd been there could read the truth. Captain Indira Kaur had flown into hell, delivered violence with precision, and brought 12 Marines home alive. When Briggs pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to her uniform, Reyes was the first to salute. The rest followed. And in that moment, standing in front of her squadron and the Marines she'd saved, Kaur felt something settle inside her, something that had been restless and uncertain for 3 years. She wasn't a fighter pilot. She would never be a fighter pilot. But she was exactly the pilot those Marines needed. She was Reaper, and that was enough. The winter passed. Kaur flew more missions. Some were routine, patrols over quiet sectors where nothing happened and the biggest threat was boredom. Others were desperate, troops in contact, danger close, the radio screaming while she put steel on target and prayed the math was right. She lost count somewhere around 70 sorties. The days blurred together, a rhythm of brief flighty brief that consumed every waking hour. The A-10 became an extension of herself. She knew its quirks, its tendencies, the way it would drift left in a climb or how the stick forces changed when the gun had been fired. She knew which switches to flip by feel alone, her hands moving through the cockpit in muscle memory patterns burned deep by repetition. And the Warthog, in turn, kept bringing her home. It took hits. 7.62 rounds, 12.7 from a heavy machine gun that punched through the left elevator and missed the hydraulics by inches. Once an RPG detonated close enough that shrapnel peppered the fuselage and cracked a section of canopy glass. Every time, Kowalski and his crew patched the damage and sent her back into the sky. "This airplane loves you," Kowalski said one afternoon, inspecting a cluster of new holes near the tail. "She takes these hits and keeps flying because she knows you'll get her home." Kaur didn't argue. There was something almost mystical about the A-10's toughness, the way it absorbed punishment that would have killed any other aircraft. It was ugly, slow, outdated by every modern metric, but it was also unkillable. And in a war zone where nothing was certain, unkillable mattered more than fast or sleek or advanced. Spring brought new challenges. The Taliban launched a major offensive across 3 provinces, pushing hard against coalition positions. The operation's tempo spiked. Kaur flew every day for 2 weeks straight, sometimes multiple sorties, landing only to refuel and rearm before launching again. Her body ran on adrenaline and bad coffee. Her mind existed in a perpetual state of tactical awareness, always calculating angles of attack, weapons employment zones, friendly positions. Sleep became something she did between missions, measured in stolen hours rather than full nights. The other pilots noticed. "You need to take a break," said Captain Vance, another A-10 pilot in her squadron. "You're running yourself into the ground." "I'm fine," Kaur replied. It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. But taking a break meant someone else would fly her missions. Someone else would be the one circling overhead when the call came in for close air support. And she couldn't shake the feeling that if she wasn't there, something would go wrong. Someone would die because she'd chosen rest over readiness. Vance studied her for a long moment. Then he said something that cut through her exhaustion. "You're not invincible, Indy, and trying to be won't help anyone." That night she forced herself to sleep. 8 hours, full stop. No alarms, no planning for the next sortie, just rest. When she woke, the world felt different, clearer. The exhaustion had been building so gradually she hadn't noticed how much it had dulled her edge. Vance was right. She couldn't save everyone, couldn't fly every mission. Couldn't be the only thing standing between the ground forces and disaster, but she could be ready. And being ready meant taking care of herself so that when the call came, she had something left to give. The squadron threw a party for her 80th sortie. Nothing fancy. Just pizza and beer in the ready room, a tradition that marked pilots who'd survived long enough to rack up serious hours in theater. Colonel Briggs showed up, said a few words about competence and dedication, then disappeared into the night like he had better places to be. Lieutenant Reyes was there too. He'd rotated back to Keating after his 2 weeks of recovery leave, and he made the drive to Bagram just to be at the party. Found Cor near the makeshift bar, nursing a beer she hadn't actually drunk. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "I know I already did officially, but I wanted to say it again. You gave us a chance. Without you, none of us would have made it out." Cor shifted uncomfortably. She'd never been good at accepting gratitude. It felt unearned somehow, like she'd just been doing her job and didn't deserve special recognition. "You would have held," she said. "Marines don't quit." "Maybe," Reyes allowed. "But we would have lost people, a lot of people. And that weighs on you knowing how close it was. Knowing that if you'd been 5 minutes later or if your aim had been off, we'd be planning memorials instead of celebrating." He extended his hand. Cor shook it. "Stay safe out there," she said. Reyes smiled. "Same to you, and if you ever need anything, I mean anything, you let me know. You've got a friend for life." After he left, Cor stood alone in the ready room, listening to the conversations around her. The other pilots were talking about missions, trading stories, laughing at the kind of dark humor that kept people sane in a war zone. They included her now. Not as the pilot who'd washed out of fighters, not as the consolation prize flying the ugly airplane, just as one of them, as Reaper, the pilot who showed up when it mattered, the pilot who delivered. She finished her beer. It tasted like mediocrity and poor life choices, but the warmth in her chest had nothing to do with the alcohol. For the first time since that evaluation report 3 years ago, Cor felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The deployment ended in June. Cor rotated back to the States, traded the mountains of Afghanistan for the flat expanse of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. The transition was jarring. One day she was flying combat sorties, putting ordnance on target, feeling the weight of lives in her hands. The next, she was flying training missions and sitting through PowerPoint briefings about budget allocations. The peacetime Air Force felt like a different world. The urgency was gone, replaced by routine and regulation and the slow grind of institutional maintenance. Cor threw herself into the work anyway. She flew training sorties with new pilots, teaching them the lessons she'd learned in the mountains. She sat through professional development courses. She wrote evaluations and counseled airmen and did all the administrative tasks that filled a captain's calendar. But part of her remained in Afghanistan. Part of her was always circling Outpost Keating, finger on the trigger, calculating the geometry of violence and protection. She dreamed about it sometimes. Not nightmares exactly, just replays. The same missions over and over, her subconscious working through the decisions, second-guessing angles of attack and weapon selections. Sometimes the dreams changed details. Sometimes she missed. Sometimes the Marines died. She'd wake in the dark, heart pounding, and have to remind herself that Reyes and his platoon had survived, that she'd done enough, that the mission was over. Her father visited in August. They sat on her apartment balcony, drinking iced tea and watching the sunset paint the Catalina Mountains in shades of orange and purple. "You're different," he said. "Not an accusation, just an observation." "How?" "Settled, like you've figured something out." Cor thought about that. "I guess I have," she said. "I'm not a fighter pilot. I'm never going to be a fighter pilot, but I'm a damn good A-10 pilot, and that matters." Her father nodded. He understood. He'd spent 30 years flying passengers across oceans, doing work that wasn't glamorous but mattered to every person who trusted him to get them home safely. "You know what I tell people when they ask about flying," he said. "I tell them it's not about the aircraft, it's about the mission, and the mission is to bring everyone home." "That's what I do," Cor said. "In the Warthog, I bring people home. Then you're exactly where you're supposed to be." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon and the desert air cooled. Cor felt something release inside her, a tension she'd been carrying since that evaluation report 3 years ago. She'd been angry, hurt, convinced that her career was over before it started. But her father was right. The mission wasn't about speed or altitude or air-to-air kills. The mission was about showing up when people needed you most and delivering the violence necessary to bring them home alive. And she was very, very good at that mission. The Distinguished Flying Cross sat in a frame on her bookshelf. She didn't display it prominently, didn't make it the centerpiece of her apartment. It was just there, alongside photos of family and a Model A-10 her crew chief had given her as a deployment gift. But sometimes, when the dreams came and the doubts crept in, she'd look at it and remember Lieutenant Reyes's voice on the radio. "You just saved our lives." The years rolled forward. Corps made major, then lieutenant colonel. She commanded a flight, then a squadron, rising through the ranks with the steady competence that defined her entire career. She deployed 3 more times, each rotation adding to the tally of sorties and close calls and lives saved. The A-10 community was small, tight-knit, filled with pilots who'd chosen the mission over glamour. They were proud of their ugly airplane, proud of its toughness, proud of the fact that when the shooting started, they were the ones the ground forces wanted overhead. Corps became a fixture in that community, not because she sought recognition, but because her reputation preceded her. Younger pilots heard the stories. The mission at Outpost Keating became legendary, passed down through generations of Warthog drivers as an example of precision and courage. They studied her tactics, analyzed her decisions, tried to understand what made her so effective. But it wasn't complicated. She showed up. She stayed. She delivered. That was the whole formula. No secret techniques. No advanced tactics that required genius-level thinking. Just relentless, methodical competence applied to the hardest missions in the most dangerous places. When Corps pinned on the rank of colonel, she inherited command of the entire A-10 wing at Davis-Monthan. It was a position that came with responsibility for hundreds of pilots and thousands of support personnel. She could have ridden a desk, managed from a distance, let the bureaucracy consume her days. Instead, she kept flying. Not every mission. She couldn't. The administrative burden was too great. But once a week, she'd sign out an aircraft and take it up, just to remember what it felt like. To keep her hands sharp. To stay connected to the mission that had defined her career. The younger pilots watched her with something approaching reverence. She was Colonel Corps, the pilot who'd saved Outpost Keating, who'd racked up over 200 combat sorties, who'd proven that the A-10 wasn't obsolete or outdated but absolutely essential. They wanted to be like her, wanted to fly with her precision, her calm, her absolute certainty under fire. She tried to teach them, but some things couldn't be taught. Some things had to be learned through experience, through the moment when the radio screamed and lives hung in the balance and you had to decide whether you were good enough to make the shot. One afternoon, a young captain named Tors approached her after a training sortie. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How do you deal with it, the pressure, knowing that if you miss, people die?" Corps considered the question. It was a good one. The kind of thing people didn't talk about enough because the answer was uncomfortable. "You don't think about missing," she said finally. "You think about all the preparation that got you to this moment, all the training, all the practice, and then you trust it. You trust yourself. Because if you can't trust yourself, the people on the ground definitely can't trust you." Tors nodded slowly, processing that. What if you do miss? The question hung in the air. Corps had never missed, not when it mattered, but she'd come close. She'd felt the uncertainty, the split-second doubt before committing to a shot. She'd lived in that space where the margin for error was so small it barely existed. "If you miss, you learn from it," she said. "You figure out what went wrong, and you make damn sure it doesn't happen again. But you can't let the fear of missing stop you from taking the shot. Because not taking the shot is a decision too, and sometimes that's the worst decision of all." Tors saluted and walked away. Corps watched him go, wondering if he'd ever face the kind of moment she'd faced at Outpost Keating. Hopping he wouldn't, knowing he probably would. That was the job. That was the mission. You trained for years, preparing for moments that might never come. And then they came all at once, compressed into seconds where everything mattered and nothing could be undone. The Air Force started talking about retiring the A-10. Budget cuts. Modernization. The same arguments that had been circling for decades. The Warthog was old, slow, vulnerable to advanced air defense systems. Better to invest in stealth fighters and unmanned drones that could strike from altitude without risk. Corps attended the meetings, listened to the arguments, watched generals and policymakers draw lines on charts and talk about capability gaps and cost per flight hour metrics. They weren't wrong exactly. The A-10 was old. It was slow. In a war against a peer adversary with modern air defenses, it would struggle. But wars weren't fought in briefing rooms. They were fought in places like the Hindu Kush, where the terrain and weather and chaos of close combat created situations that required a pilot to look the enemy in the eye and put steel exactly where it needed to go. No drone could do that. No stealth fighter wanted to. When they asked for her input, she kept it simple. The A-10 does one thing better than any other aircraft in our inventory. It saves lives. If we retire it without a replacement that can do the same mission, we're going to lose people. It's that simple. The debate continued, would probably continue for years, but Corps had said her piece. She'd lived the mission. She knew what the Warthog could do, what it had done, what it would continue to do as long as someone was willing to fly it. Her final deployment came in her 22nd year of service. She didn't have to go. Colonels rarely deployed anymore. But when the opportunity came, she volunteered. One last rotation. One last chance to do the mission that had defined her career. They sent her to Syria. Different terrain than Afghanistan. Different enemy. But the same fundamental job: provide close air support to ground forces engaged in contact with a determined adversary. Corps flew 70 missions in 6 months. Everyone felt like coming home. On her final sortie, she flew over a battered city where coalition forces were clearing the last holdouts of a dug-in enemy. The ground commander was a Marine captain named Rodriguez, young, intense, reminded her of Lieutenant Ray's 2 decades ago. Hog 5-1, we need gun runs on a building complex at Grid November Delta 738415. Multiple shooters. Danger close to our position. Corps checked the coordinates. The building was 200 meters from the friendly positions. Close but manageable. She rolled in, lined up the shot, and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared. The building disappeared in a cloud of pulverized concrete and smoke. When the dust cleared, Rodriguez came back on the radio, his voice carrying the same relief she'd heard from Ray's all those years ago. Good hit, Hog. Threat neutralized. Corps climbed back to altitude, circling the city one last time. This would be her last combat mission. The last time she'd put ordnance on target for real. The last time lives would depend on her ability to deliver violence with precision. She felt the weight of it. Not regret, not sadness, just a profound sense of completion. This was what she'd been meant to do. This was the mission that had taken a failed fighter pilot and turned her into something more important. Not the fastest, not the flashiest. But when people were dying and the situation was desperate, she was the one they called. She was Reaper, the pilot who stayed, the pilot who delivered. The pilot who brought people home. When she landed at the deployed location for the last time, her crew chief was waiting. Not Kowalski. He'd retired years ago, but the tradition continued. The new generation of maintainers who kept the Warthogs flying. "How'd she do, ma'am?" the crew chief asked. Corps patted the scarred fuselage of the A-10, its paint faded and pitted from years of combat. "She did good," Corps said. "She always does." 3 months later, Colonel Indira Kaur retired from the Air Force. There was a ceremony, speeches about valor and dedication. The traditional final flight where she buzzed the runway one last time before landing and taxiing to a water cannon salute. She stood at attention while the wing commander read her service record. 23 years, 217 combat sorties, 3 distinguished flying crosses, a silver star, more air medals than anyone bothered counting. But the numbers didn't capture what mattered. They didn't capture the Marines at Outpost Keating, the convoy on the highway, the troops in the battered city, all the people who were alive because she'd been there when it mattered. After the ceremony, after the well-wishers had dispersed and the crowd had thinned, Corps found herself alone on the flight line. The A-10s sat in their revetments, gray and ugly and absolutely beautiful. She walked to the nearest one, ran her hand along its wing. 23 years she'd flown this aircraft. 23 years of learning its quirks and capabilities, of trusting it to bring her home, of delivering the violence that saved lives. The Warthog didn't care that she was retiring. It would fly again tomorrow, piloted by someone younger, someone who was just beginning their own journey. But for this moment it was hers. One last time. She whispered 2 words into the desert wind. "Thank you." Then she turned and walked away, leaving the flight line behind. Leaving the cockpit, leaving the mission, but carrying with her the knowledge that for 23 years, when people needed her most, she'd been exactly where she was supposed to be, delivering, always delivering. The A-10 remained, the mission remained, and somewhere in some future crisis that hadn't happened yet, another pilot would climb into that cockpit and discover what she'd learned 2 decades ago. That sometimes the best thing you can be isn't the fastest or the most advanced. Sometimes the best thing you can be is there, present, capable, ready to deliver when lives hang in the balance. That was the legacy of Reaper. That was the legend of the pilot who stayed. And long after Colonel Indira Kaur hung up her flight suit, the story would endure, passed down through generations of Warthog drivers. A reminder that glory comes in many forms, and sometimes the greatest heroism is found in the unglamorous work of showing up, staying on station, and bringing everyone home.